And the reality is that it would become way too much for him to bear, and he would eventually agree to let God's people go. However, God wanted to ensure that as this plague came on the land, that his people, his chosen people, were spared from this destruction. And so he gave them specific instructions on what they were to do in order to be spared from this plague that was going to sweep through the land, and to ultimately ensure their freedom and their deliverance. So, Exodus 12, you're all there and have been waiting very patiently for me to get there. We're there. So let's read this story. These are God's instructions to the nation of Israel. Exodus 12 and verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month," make a mental note of that if you would, underline it, circle it, whatever, make a mental note of the 10th day. On the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor. Having taken into account the number of people there are, you are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. Verse 5, the animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month. Make a mental note of that, circle that, highlight it. You'll want to know that date as well. Until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Verse 12, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. Okay? This is the origin of the Feast of Passover. Now the people followed God's instructions, and that night they indeed were liberated from their slavery and bondage, and they marched right out of Egypt. Okay? So every year, the people would celebrate this festival as God instructed them to commemorate and to remember how God freed them from slavery. A pretty significant event, huh? However, it became much more than just remembering this day when they were led out of physical slavery. The slaughtering of an unblemished lamb became actually the religious practice for receiving forgiveness for their sins as well, or this idea of being liberated from the slavery of sin. Okay? So not only through God's instructions, the slaughtering of a lamb took on not only the significance of what they actually had to do in remembering this whole practice of physically being delivered, but it became the necessary requirement for them to receive forgiveness for their sins through the blood of an innocent lamb. Okay? Everybody tracking so far? This practice of sacrificing an innocent lamb had to be done by each individual family, which was important as well. You see God's instruction that each man, each member, each household had to have a lamb of their own. And that sacrifice was only good for your family. So every family had to do this. And it was something they had to do quite regularly to cover their sins. As you read throughout the Old Testament, you'll see over and over and over again God requiring them, because obviously the sins that we bear are great. And so there was the constant needing for this shedding of innocent blood in order to cover the sins that they had committed. But the prophets still would come on a quite regular basis as well. We read in the Old Testament, the prophets would come and they would speak of this Messiah who would come. And they would actually refer to him in relation to the Passover celebration. They would refer to this Messiah who would be a lamb who would be slaughtered for many. Listen to the words from Isaiah 53, a familiar passage for those of you probably who have been around the church for a while. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed, he asks. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Speaking of Jesus here, if you're wondering. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Verse 4, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was like a lamb led to the slaughter. And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And so you see the references over and over again in the Old Testament of this Messiah, this lamb who would come as a sacrifice for many. So this festival, the Feast of Passover, was celebrated year after year after year. Okay? When the temple was built in Jerusalem, there was then a requirement that the Jewish people would make pilgrimage from wherever they lived. They were required to go to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover and to sacrifice their Passover lamb there. So people literally, wherever they were at, this was the requirement. If you were a good Jewish person, everyone would go. The historian Josephus says that the population of Jerusalem went from about 50,000 to, he records and says, during the Feast of Passover there were about 3 million people in the city of Jerusalem. I mean, that's how many people are making this journey and this pilgrimage. It was something that everybody did and participated in. Okay, so fast forward then to the times of Jesus. Now, Jewish people in Jesus' day and age would still make this pilgrimage every year from wherever they were to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. Now, remember, Jesus was Jewish, and so he would have grown up with these practices that we speak of. This was part of his routine, okay? Every year as he grew up, and even the times that we read of in his life in the Gospels. An interesting thing to note here, and I just want to make a little side note here. Interesting to note what John the Baptist says of Jesus on one of his first public encounters with him recorded in John chapter 1 and verse 36. John 1 and 36, John looks at Jesus and says this, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Isn't that cool? This would have been, we look over that and go, okay, so what, whatever. But this would have been a very significant statement to the Jewish audience of the time, who is very familiar with the story of the Passover and the practice of slaughtering a lamb for the forgiveness of sins. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Okay, let's fast forward again then to the year that Jesus was crucified. We're making great time, gone all the way from Genesis to Jesus' death. There's a week in the Christian calendar that we celebrate as Holy Week. Is everybody familiar with Holy Week? Holy Week just remembers and commemorates Jesus' last week on earth, and it consists of several significant holidays that we kind of commemorate in this last week. It starts on Palm Sunday, right? Palm Sunday, and this was the day when everybody was waving palm branches and crying out to Jesus as he was coming out into Jerusalem. Then there's also Maundy Thursday. Maundy Thursday commemorates the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. And then there's Good Friday, which is the day that we celebrate that Jesus, I don't know if celebration's the right word, but I guess in a roundabout way it is. Jesus suffering on the cross. And then Holy Week ends with Easter, which obviously we celebrate the resurrection of Christ from the grave.